At exactly 3:47 in the morning, the city of Doha was asleep under a blanket of silence. Then, without warning, the night sky cracked open. The thunder of Israeli F-35 jets tore through the stillness, and precision missiles rained down on the capital of Qatar. Towers that once sparkled with light became silhouettes of fire. Families fled into the streets barefoot, clutching their children, searching for shelter where none could be found. Tel Aviv called it counter-terrorism. Officials wrapped the destruction in polished phrases of defense and security. But beneath those words lay a harsher truth: sovereignty had been violated in its purest form. For decades, smaller nations, whether in the Middle East, Africa, or Latin America, were told to accept such actions as the natural order of things. Some murmured disapproval, others stayed silent, but few dared to act. That was the expectation in September 2025. Yet this time, the silence broke not in Washington, not in Brussels, but in the heart of Africa. From Ouagadougou, a young leader named Ibrahim Traoré lifted his phone and called Benjamin Netanyahu directly. His words were sharp, uncompromising. Africa will not stay silent. It was more than a phone call. It was a rupture in history. Within hours, embassies trembled, contracts faltered, and Israel, long accustomed to global silence, suddenly felt the weight of Africa pressing back. What began as flames in Doha was fast becoming a continental awakening. And so, we must ask, can the voice of one small nation shift the balance of world power? Can sovereignty, when defended with courage, force even the mighty to pause? Stay with us, because this story is not about Qatar alone. It is about the future of Africa, the future of dignity, and perhaps even the future of the world. Please share this video if you believe Africa's voice must be heard. And subscribe if you believe that sovereignty is always more important than dependency. The world often remembers dates carved by fire. September 2025 was one of those moments, beginning in the dark silence of Doha. At precisely 3:47 in the morning, Israeli F-35 jets pierced the night sky. Their engines roared like thunder over the Persian Gulf, their missiles streaking downward in deadly arcs. Within seconds, towers that had once defined Doha's skyline shook violently. Windows shattered, flames burst from apartment blocks, and families ran barefoot into streets littered with glass. Mothers held children tight, fathers tried to guide loved ones through smoke, while the elderly staggered toward mosques now reduced to rubble. Israel's leadership called it a preemptive strike cloaked in the familiar vocabulary of counterterrorism and self-defense. Yet, the truth was undeniable. This was not Gaza, a territory long denied recognition. This was Doha, the capital of a sovereign nation, a member of the United Nations, a country with embassies, partnerships, and international standing. To strike here was to send a message far beyond the Middle East: no capital is untouchable. The reaction on the ground was immediate. Hospitals overflowed with wounded civilians. Emergency sirens wailed across the city. Qatar's leaders appeared on national television, visibly shaken but resolute, calling the act a violation of every principle of international law. Yet the unspoken question hung heavy: who would dare speak on their behalf? Who would risk defying Tel Aviv when Washington and Brussels could be counted on to shield it? For decades, that question had a predictable answer. Small nations remained silent. African capitals issued cautious press releases, or none at all. Dependency on foreign aid and military cooperation kept many governments muted. Sovereignty, though celebrated in rhetoric, was too often bartered away in practice. The assumption was simple: Israel could act and the world would eventually move on. But this time something shifted. Thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, the images of smoke rising over Doha reached the desk of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso. He watched as families fled through broken streets, as Qatar's skyline turned into fire. And in that moment, he recognized a profound truth: if one nation's sovereignty could be violated so casually, then none were safe. Not in the Middle East, not in Africa, not anywhere. Unlike other leaders who relied on aides to draft statements, Traoré took an extraordinary step. He picked up the phone himself, not to a minister, not to an ambassador, but directly to Benjamin Netanyahu. The line crackled as satellites connected Ouagadougou to Tel Aviv. The young African leader's words were not wrapped in diplomatic caution. They were direct, sharp, and unyielding. Africa will not stay silent. That single phone call shattered decades of assumptions. For years, Israel and its allies had believed African nations would remain passive observers, concerned only with their own survival. They counted on dependence on aid on military training programs that bound governments in silence. But now the calculation collapsed. A small, landlocked nation, often dismissed as poor and peripheral, had dared to confront one of the world's most militarized states. The impact was immediate. Within 6 hours, Israel's ambassador in Ouagadougou requested urgent clarification. Within 12 hours, Netanyahu's office reached out to the African Union seeking dialogue. And within 24 hours, defense contractors in Tel Aviv were recalculating billions of dollars tied to partnerships in Africa. Burkina Faso's reaction was not symbolic, it was concrete. From the presidential palace came a decree suspending all military cooperation with Israel, training programs canceled, defense contracts terminated, intelligence channels severed. It was a rupture, not a rebuke. In international politics, such steps carry real weight. They were not words for headlines, they were consequences. For Israel, the shock was palpable. For Africa, the symbolism was electric. Here was a leader who refused to accept that sovereignty was negotiable, who chose dignity over dependency. Citizens across the continent began to whisper and then to proclaim that perhaps this was the moment Africa had been waiting for. And so what began as a midnight strike on Doha was no longer confined to the Gulf. It had crossed continents, igniting a fire in the heart of Africa. The question was no longer whether Qatar's sovereignty had been violated. The question was whether Africa itself would continue to stand on the sidelines or whether under the voice of Ibrahim Traoré it would finally rise. History often pivots on a single decision, a single voice unwilling to bend. For Africa, that moment came when Ibrahim Traoré's phone call to Benjamin Netanyahu was followed not by silence but by decisive action. He did not allow his words to linger as rhetoric. Within hours, he issued a sweeping decree: all military cooperation with Israel was to be suspended effective immediately. This was unprecedented. For years, Israel had cultivated quiet but profitable ties across the Sahel, training security forces, supplying surveillance equipment, and signing defense contracts worth billions. Many assumed those deals were untouchable, that no African leader would dare risk canceling them. But from Ouagadougou, the order was clear. Training programs halted overnight. Israeli advisors were told to pack their bags. Intelligence-sharing channels went dark. Contracts signed in Tel Aviv's boardrooms became worthless pieces of paper. The shock reverberated instantly. Israeli diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout. The ambassador in Burkina Faso requested emergency meetings, pleading for reconsideration. In Tel Aviv, officials tried to downplay the rupture, calling it a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. The message from Ouagadougou was unmistakable. Sovereignty is not negotiable, and the boldness of one nation triggered a chain reaction. By the 24th hour, 15 African leaders had issued official condemnations of Israel's strike, echoing Traoré's language. Some of these governments had long walked cautiously between Western aid and their people's demand for dignity. But now, inspired by Burkina Faso's defiance, they found new courage. By the 48th hour, the African Union convened an emergency session. Normally known for long speeches and symbolic resolutions, this time the tone was different. Delegates arrived with a sense of urgency. They were not debating words, they were debating action. And by the 72nd hour, the unthinkable unfolded. African ambassadors were recalled from Tel Aviv. South Africa suspended diplomatic relations. Algeria closed its airspace. Morocco severed agricultural partnerships. Nigeria canceled defense contracts. In Israeli newsrooms, analysts could no longer hide their alarm. "This is unprecedented," one remarked. For the first time, Israel faced not scattered criticism, but coordinated retaliation from an entire continent. The ripple did not stop in Africa. Across the Arab world, leaders pointed to Burkina Faso's stance as a model. The Arab League invited Ibrahim Traoré to address an emergency session. In Ankara, Turkey praised Africa's courage. In Tehran, Iran's foreign minister declared, "Africa has shown the world what it means to defend sovereignty." Even in Latin America, where nations had long struggled under foreign pressure, leaders drew inspiration from Africa's unified voice. Meanwhile, in Washington and Brussels, discomfort grew. American envoys traveled hurriedly through African capitals, warning that such defiance threatened regional stability. CIA operatives whispered of reductions in aid and security cooperation. European diplomats issued cautious statements calling for dialogue, but conspicuously avoided naming Israel as the aggressor. For ordinary Africans, this imbalance only confirmed what they had long suspected. When the West speaks of law and order, it too often means law for some, impunity for others. On the streets of Africa's cities, the reaction was electric. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Dar es Salaam to Dakar, citizens marched with placards declaring solidarity with Qatar and pride in Africa's defiance. Social media platforms surged with hashtags linking Ouagadougou to Doha, carrying a simple but powerful message: Africa will not stay silent. Artists painted murals of Traore holding a phone against a backdrop of burning towers. Musicians released songs celebrating sovereignty as the new anthem of a rising continent. For Israel's defense industry, panic set in. Billions of dollars in contracts evaporated. Mining concessions and agricultural ventures tied to Israeli firms froze overnight. Investors in New York and London whispered the same fear: Africa was no longer just a market, it was a judge. And so the climax of this story was not a missile falling on Doha. It was the sound of silence on the other end of Netanyahu's phone line, African presidents refusing his calls, hanging up after seconds, or declining entirely. For decades, Tel Aviv assumed that Africa's dependence guaranteed compliance. But in those tense hours, that assumption collapsed. The world watched in disbelief. A young leader from one of Africa's poorest nations had lit a fire of sovereignty that spread across continents. The high point was not only the cancellation of contracts or the recalling of ambassadors. The true climax was the realization that the global order itself was trembling, not from bombs in the sky, but from voices long dismissed, now speaking in unison. What began in the silence of a night sky over Doha had become a storm of consequence. For Israel, it was a strategic disaster. For Africa, it was a moment of awakening. And for the rest of the world, it was a warning: the age of African silence was over. The strike on Doha may have lit the spark, but the aftermath in Africa revealed just how far the fire had spread. What began as a confrontation in the skies soon transformed into tremors that shook daily life, politics, and economics across an entire continent. For Israel, the consequences were brutal and immediate. Contracts once worth billions evaporated overnight. Defense companies accustomed to lucrative deals in the Sahel training armies, supplying drones, selling surveillance systems, suddenly found their agreements torn apart. Mining concessions linked to Israeli firms froze. Agricultural ventures in West Africa stalled. Even oil projects tied to Tel Aviv's investors were suspended. In Tel Aviv's financial district, boardrooms buzzed with panic. Analysts whispered the same fear: Africa was no longer a passive client. It had become an active judge capable of canceling projects not with bombs, but with boycotts. Yet the reverberations were not confined to Israel's balance sheets. They seeped deeply into Burkina Faso's own fragile landscape. Already wrestling with displacement from insurgencies, weak infrastructure, and limited resources, the country now faced immense pressure from abroad. Washington hinted at reductions in security assistance. European lenders quietly reviewed ongoing projects. International NGOs raised questions about aid programs. In hushed tones, Western diplomats suggested that defiance would come with a price tag Burkina Faso could not afford. Inside Ouagadougou's markets, the debate was raw and human. Some worried that food and fuel prices would rise, that international loans would dry up, that their already difficult lives might become unbearable. "We cannot eat sovereignty," one shopkeeper muttered, reflecting a fear that dignity could not fill empty stomachs. Yet others countered passionately: "If we give up now, what will our children inherit? Dependency forever." In village squares and city cafes, this clash of ideas filled conversations. It was not an abstract policy debate, it was survival versus pride, fear versus dignity. At the same time, a new current was flowing: confidence in leadership. Ibrahim Traoré, once viewed with skepticism by some, suddenly became a symbol of defiance, not only against Israel, but against decades of African subservience. His willingness to act decisively inspired admiration across the continent. Opinion polls inside Burkina Faso surged in his favor. Opposition parties once vocal found themselves cornered. To criticize Traoré now risked appearing aligned with foreign powers. Politics once fractured suddenly revolved around the unifying theme of sovereignty. But boldness carried danger. Intelligence services began reporting chatter of assassination plots. Commentators abroad speculated openly that Traoré might not survive long given the magnitude of interests he had disrupted. The idea of an Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt whispered through corridors of power in Africa and Europe alike. History reminded citizens that leaders who resist global structures often pay the highest price. The fear was real, but so was the resolve. The ripple effects extended beyond politics into culture and identity. Social media exploded with hashtags linking Ouagadougou to Doha, turning solidarity into a global conversation. Young Africans produced art and music portraying their continent as the defender of sovereignty. In Burkina Faso, murals appeared depicting a phone in Traoré's hand as a weapon of dignity more powerful than missiles. Across cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Dakar, rallies filled streets with chants of pride, anger, and unity. Still, the risks could not be ignored. Burkina Faso's fragile economy was vulnerable. Rumors spread that loans might be delayed, that international projects could stall, that prices of essential goods would climb. Critics inside and outside the country claimed Traoré had overreached. But supporters responded that sovereignty cannot be half-claimed. To condemn Israel's action without consequence would have been to surrender in silence. Thus, the civil and political consequences were two-sided. On one hand, Burkina Faso stood taller, its people prouder, its leader emboldened. On the other hand, shadows lengthened: economic uncertainty, diplomatic isolation, and threats to stability. Yet for millions of Africans, the choice seemed clear: better to bear hardship with dignity than to live in comfort under dependency. The bombing of Doha had spilled far beyond Qatar's borders. In Africa, it reshaped politics, swayed economies, stirred identities, and reminded ordinary citizens that sovereignty was not just a word for speeches, but a principle worth sacrifice. The soil of Africa, long trampled by outside powers, was finally sprouting something new, a fragile but undeniable seed of defiance. When the news of Africa's defiance spread, the United States moved first. State Department officials placed urgent calls to African capitals, warning that overreaction could destabilize the region. CIA envoys quietly reminded presidents of counterterrorism, PAC's aid packages, and intelligence-sharing deals. The message was blunt: temper your defiance or pay the cost. Yet what Washington miscalculated was the mood. Instead of folding under pressure, many African leaders felt emboldened by the momentum of continental unity. For the first time in decades, American warnings were met not with deference, but with silence, sometimes even refusal. Europe responded differently, yet no less revealing. In Brussels, carefully worded statements spoke of the need for dialogue and restraint, but there was no direct criticism of Israel's violation of Qatar's sovereignty. To African observers, this was proof of a double standard they had long suspected. Europe preaches international law when convenient, but retreats into caution when allies are involved. The silence rang louder than words, fueling resentment across African capitals. Meanwhile, in the Middle East and beyond, Africa's stance became a rallying cry. The Arab League invited Ibrahim Traoré to address an emergency summit, praising Burkina Faso as the moral voice the world lacked. In Ankara, Turkey's leaders lauded Africa's courage, calling it a reminder of principles long forgotten. Tehran declared Africa has shown the world what sovereignty means. Even across Latin America, nations historically battered by foreign interference drew inspiration. Leaders in Caracas and La Paz echoed Africa's language, tying their own histories of resistance to this new awakening. For Israel, the fallout was devastating. Its foreign minister dispatched delegations across Africa only to be met with closed doors. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant personally flew to several capitals, but found contracts canceled and receptions icy. On Israeli television, analysts admitted what politicians could not: Africa had become a diplomatic battlefield Tel Aviv could no longer ignore. The global media landscape amplified the shock. From the Washington Post to Al Jazeera, headlines declared Africa's retaliation unprecedented. Social media surged with images of African flags beside Qatari skylines, hashtags uniting Ouagadougou and Doha. In a striking reversal, Burkina Faso news became shorthand for sovereignty, a symbol of resistance in a world where smaller nations are too often sidelined. And yet unease lingered. Would Western powers attempt to isolate Africa economically? Would they fracture its unity with offers and threats? Or would they be forced at last to reckon with a continent of 1.4 billion citizens, speaking in one voice? The answer to those questions would determine more than Africa's fate. It would shape the very balance of global order in the years ahead. The smoke over Doha has begun to clear, but the echoes of that night still thunder across continents. What started as missiles falling on a sleeping city has become something far larger, a test of sovereignty, dignity, and the courage of nations too often dismissed as powerless. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, showed that even a small landlocked nation can tilt the balance of world politics with one decisive act. But defiance carries a price. Washington's warnings grow sharper, Brussels' hesitations more obvious, and whispers of economic sanctions linger in the air. Rumors of assassination plots remind us that leaders who resist entrenched power often walk the most dangerous roads. The risks are real. Yet so too is the promise: a continent no longer silent, a people no longer spectators, a movement no longer waiting for permission. And so we are left with the questions that matter most. Can Africa sustain this unity in the face of mounting pressure? Will President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies of reform and sovereignty hold? Or will history demand another leader to carry the torch? These are not abstract questions. They will define whether Africa remains dependent or finally claims its rightful place as a decisive actor on the global stage. For those watching from abroad, especially here in America, the challenge is clear. Will we recognize Africa's new voice with respect, or will we repeat the mistakes of treating it as marginal? The answer will shape not only Africa's tomorrow, but our own. If you believe that sovereignty must always come before dependency, then do not let this moment fade. Please share this video if you are proud that Africa has finally raised its voice. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. Together, let us stand witness to the dawn of a new Africa rising not in silence, but in defiance.